This video is the second of a three-part series of how to respond to disclosures of sexual abuse. The goal of these three videos is to inform us as to why disclosures of sexual abuse are so daunting for the survivor and how we can respond in a manner that is informed and compassionate. To accomplish this, we are examining or exploring why survivors are silenced. We are also going to explore how disclosures of sexual abuse have distinct characteristics. And then third, how we respond with compassion. In the first video of this three-part series, we began looking at 7 reasons as to why survivors are silenced. We covered 4 of them in that first video. And those reasons, for the most part, had to do with wounds inflicted by individuals who were hearing the disclosure. The 5th reason that we come to now in this video is wounds inflicted by institutions. Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer have written a book entitled A Church Called Tov. In Hebrew, Tov means kindness or goodness. And so the purpose of the authors was to explain to us how a church can respond and carry out their function, their ministry, with kindness and goodness. Unfortunately, kindness and goodness has not been demonstrated when survivors of either sexual abuse or power abuse come forward to make their accusation. McKnight points out how institutions create false narratives. And these false narratives are intended to protect the leadership within that institution. But unfortunately, they are deeply wounding to the person bringing the accusation, the victim. These institutions include churches, denominations, athletic associations, Hollywood, universities. It's hard to think of an institution that would be excluded because there are so many unfortunate examples of how false narratives have been created to protect that institution when an accusation comes against them. Now, from the book, The Church Called Tov, I am going to cite 6 false narratives. These are fabricated accounts, fabricated narratives whenever an accusation is brought against the leadership and the institution. The first one is to discredit the victim who is making the accusation. In short, this is character assassination. And it can occur through such simple and yet cruel statements. For example, if the victim coming forward is a woman, or it could be a man, the statement would be made, we know that they're emotionally unstable, or we know that they're a loose cannon. Very simple, yet cruel statements. So discredit the victim who is disclosing is a first false narrative that we need to understand that's used by institutions. A second one is to gaslight the victim. Gaslighting is a psychological manipulation whereby the attempt is to get the victim to begin questioning their own memory, their own perspective, their own judgment of what it was that occurred. It's especially effective when within the institution, the perpetrator is a person who has power over the victim. With gaslighting, the person with the power attempts to put the victim on the defensive and to destabilize them by making the victim somehow feel that they are the ones responsible for what happened. Here would be an example of a gaslighting statement. A person's been accused, the victim comes to them, and the perpetrator says something like this: "Are you telling me that after all the times you came to me when you were in a tough situation And all those times when I listened to you, I gave you energy, my time, I even cared what was happening. And yet now you're coming to me with this accusation. It's an attempt to turn it back to a blame upon the victim. So, gaslighting. A third false narrative is to make the perpetrator the victim. In recent years, there's an unfortunate example of a megachurch where multiple women came forward with accusations against the lead pastor because of his sexual advances. The lead pastor denied those accusations. The board of the church came to the defense, not of the victims, but of the pastor. And they issued this statement: "We have deep sadness. After 42 years of faithfully pastoring you and me, and after his family giving sacrificially, this has been painful beyond words for them." In that statement, there was total disregard for the victims, and it made it sound like the pastor was the victim. By the way, an important fact to note here is that the investigations revealed that the accusations were legitimate. The entire board of that church resigned, and the pastor is no longer there. However, deep wounds were inflicted by that institution upon the survivors. Another example of the perpetrator being postured as the victim is with the statement, "Oh, we are hurting too." The fourth false narrative used by institutions is to suppress the truth. This is most commonly done through non-disclosure agreements. There's an example of a powerful individual who was sexually abusing a woman. She came forward, and eventually she was convinced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Sadly, that freed the perpetrator to continue in his acts of abuse, which he did. Years later, when he was found guilty of additional acts of abuse, the attempts of the initial person who had signed the non-disclosure agreement to come forward and to be part of the settlements and the evidence was totally dismissed because of that non-disclosure agreement. So silencing the truth is a popular mechanism of institutions. Closely related is another false narrative of suppressing the truth. This is done through numerous tactics. One would be shaming the victim. Another one would be threatening a lawsuit, or to say an investigation is underway. That's an attempt to get everyone to be quiet. Another means of suppressing the truth would be to delete emails, delete text messages, destroy any type of evidence. And when the institution is a church, here's a common statement that is often made to survivors who are coming forward with their accusation. The statement is this: if you bring this accusation, it will then destroy and bring down the ministry. Again, total disregard for the survivor of the abuse. And then a final false narrative is that of issuing a fake apology. All of us have heard fake apologies, and it is common among institutions when an accusation is brought against them. Here's some examples. "I'm sorry if you feel that way." In other words, this is really your problem that you feel that way. Or, "It was never our intent." Now, allow me a little bit of latitude here. I want to finish that sentence for those who use it. It's like saying, "It was never our intent to get caught," but sadly, it was their intent to do the abuse. And then another example is, "It was outside of our control." So we have just looked at 6 false narratives issued by institutions. Are you beginning to understand why survivors of sexual abuse are silenced? Now let's come back to our main list of these 7 reasons, and we come to the 6th reason, which is extremely important to note, and that is the effect of trauma on the brain, anyone's brain. This is a very simple image of the brain because it's only labeling 3 parts of so many. But each of these parts are significant when it comes to trauma. First of all, there's the prefrontal cortex. That's where all of our planning, decision-making, and problem-solving occur. Then you see the amygdala. Its function is to sense danger, to set off alarms. So when a person's safety is threatened, when there's danger, in other words, sexual abuse is occurring, the amygdala overrides the prefrontal cortex, or the conscious part of the brain. And when the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to the muscles, adrenaline rushes throughout the body, and there's 3 possible responses: fight, flight, or flee. Other systems not crucial to survival are switched off. Then third, you have the hippocampus, which files and stores memories for subsequent retrieval. But in times of danger, for example, when abuse is occurring, the hippocampus goes offline and stops filing memories because the energy is all being diverted elsewhere. So in trauma, the survival function overtakes the rational, and memories get stuck and can be jumbled and fragmented. In recent years, in law enforcement, when a woman came forward with an accusation of rape, if she was not able to remember all of the details and sequence, in years past, the law enforcement was quick to dismiss that accusation, assuming that, well, if you can't remember it, it must not have happened. In more recent years now, training has occurred, and law enforcement has come to realize, having been trained and educated in the neurological studies, some of which I just briefly outlined for you here, as law enforcement came to understand that no longer was the inability to remember sequence and details used against the rape victim. In some ways, it even became evidence that the accusation would be true. We come now to the final reason as to why survivors are silenced, and that is developmental. When a child is sexually abused, that child does not have the vocabulary to explain what happened to them. So many survivors have said, I did not have the words. There's one survivor who, when asked why she had not disclosed earlier, said, because he lived in my house, referring to her father, who is the perpetrator. So there are developmental reasons for a child as to why it's impossible for them to know how to disclose the abuse. How can young children possibly begin to talk about how someone who was supposed to care for them and yet did the unthinkable to them, how can they possibly begin to speak of that? So we have noted now 7 reasons why survivors are silent. In the next video, we're going to examine how disclosures of sexual abuse have distinct characteristics, and then how we can respond with compassion.